What's up, everybody? How's it going? You know, I watched a video this morning, a Joe Rogan video, where he had a guy named Sir Roger Penrose on, and he was talking about the universe, consciousness, existence, but on a scientific basis. He's a scientist who explores. One of his fascinations is consciousness itself, and I've been wanting to make a video talking about this today, and I've actually made a couple other videos in the meantime, and I just haven't been able to figure out how to word it, so I thought I'd just start the camera and just go. Because I realized the problem is that there's absolutely nothing I can teach or show anybody about what consciousness is. It's like trying to explain life. You can get all the details about how enzymes and cells operate and reproduce, and in the end you're just left shaking your head like, this does not explain to me what life is. You know, the biological processes don't explain what life is. Well, on the same token, the processes of the mind don't explain consciousness very well. And when you talk about these things, it ends up getting into some very woo-woo territory. And this is why neuroscience and the study of humans in general and consciousness is kind of stuck, in the sense that you're using consciousness to try to understand it. And what I've found is that a lot of people seem to think that there are experts out there who have this figured out. Say, well, we've explained consciousness, or we will soon, and that it's definitely of biological origin. Yet we still have dozens and dozens of prominent scientists who write papers, obscure little papers that end up in these journals with their proposals about, well, perhaps this is what consciousness is, or perhaps this is what it is, and the idea that it perhaps may not necessarily originate from outside the body, but rather have a process that is so beyond our comprehension that it seems like we defend ourselves against thinking about it by just saying, well, we understand where it comes from. In other words, let me give you an example. Even if you're a religious person and you believe in the soul, or you believe in the spirit, if you go deeper and you start investigating, you start to ask yourself, well, where did these originate? How did they divide? What happened before there were souls? Were there always these souls? What happens after the cycle is over? Do we merge together? The deeper philosophical questions, even if you take, say, religion at face value, you're left wanting. It's like the idea the other day when I talked to those Mormons, and I was like, it's great that you believe in a heaven that's eternal happiness in the same body, but is that really what you would want? Have you thought it through? And with consciousness, it's the same way. We have these little explanations for, well, it must be from biological origin, and it must have just evolved over time, and for so long we thought we were the only conscious creatures in a way. I mean, I grew up with people saying, well, animals don't have the same feelings we do, and they can't think and rationalize, and we're special because of this. But now we know that elephants will actually, for example, leave their path to go mourn a lost loved one who died years before. One particular case that the Roger Penrose talked about was these elephants who were on the way from point A to point B, and they took a detour and went to this old dry lake bed where the leader's sister had died years before. And they picked up the bones and they passed them around, and then they went back and continued on their journey. These elephants consciously decided, well, we're going to go pay respects to our lost loved ones. This is something so far beyond anything that we could have imagined. In fact, I can imagine scientists are just cringing in some fields. Maybe not just scientists, but people in general. I mean, religions too, who want to believe that we are the ones who are feeling and conscious and aware, and that animals were just put here for mankind. That kind of idea. What it does is it empowers us to realize consciousness expands beyond individual humans into the animal kingdom. But if you propose something like, what are trees? Are trees conscious? Then people will laugh at you. Well, of course not. We draw the line at plants. But why? If you look at the science, there is ample evidence to support that plants are aware of our intentions. that leaves will emit an electrical signal when they're about to be harmed or when a plant nearby is being harmed. These things are completely ignored because they just confuse the hell out of us and we don't understand it. They've found cells on the tips of tree roots that resemble the neurons. And the idea is that perhaps the tree roots contain their own neural network that functions somewhat like a human brain. And why not? They're sending signals, information. If something happens to one tree, they can send information through the fungus in the soil, the mycelium, to other trees on the other side of the forest to warn them, or to not open up their pine cones, or to not, or to close their leaves up, try to protect themselves from whatever's coming. It's pretty absurd to us to believe that all these creatures are conscious, but also that nature itself is conscious. To me, it just seems obvious. So when I say something like I believe in the Gaian hypothesis to an extent, that the Earth is conscious, people might laugh at that and say, well, that's ridiculous. The planet's just a planet. And I say, but it fits all the attributes of a life form. It's self-regulating, you know? It's constantly in flux, of course, but it operates on a different level than we do. The self-similarity in space and in the nano, the macro and the micro level, this is where you start to get into woo-woo territory, and people are like, whoa, wait a minute, you know, just because things look a certain way doesn't mean that they are, and just because we see these same patterns doesn't mean, you know, that there's some spiritual Godhead behind everything. But that's never the question. It doesn't matter whether or not there's a Godhead behind it all. What matters is the universe itself conscious. If we're conscious, and our cells are conscious in their own way, you know, it's what the only thing we have really left that, when you break it all down, I guess my point is that what we're really trying to understand is, are we different in any way, but than other animals, or are we exceptional in the universe rather? But even more than that, what is consciousness? It's the one question that evades us, but is the most important question before all other answers. Even if you're just say, well, I believe in this particular religion. You say, well, God imbued you with consciousness, or so what is this consciousness that you were given? You know, how does it operate? Is it sent in waves? Is it sent in signals to your brain? Or is your brain decoding this information and then you're acting on it? Or are you pre-programmed with it? How much do your genes actually reflect the environment around you? And how much of it is epigenetics and how much of it is genetics, you know? People like to dismiss anything that is outside of the scientific norm. But what we're finding is the scientific norm is to dismiss and omit anything that may conflict with our idea that everything is just made in the brain. And there are these things called microtubules, which are suspect right now in being partially responsible for consciousness. They're within the neurons in the brain. They apparently, I don't understand how they work and operate, but they apparently fit kind of the Fibonacci sequence or the phi ratio, whichever I guess it is. You've got this these little tubule type things, however they work, that they believe have something to do with consciousness, but we don't know how much. And I remember during the Rogan interview, I think it was Penrose, said something about, but these are also found, or Joe said, aren't these also microtubules also found in other organs in the body, like the liver and the heart? And wouldn't that mean that maybe they're not part of consciousness? My instant thought right then was, our organs are conscious in their own way. And let me explain before that sounds ridiculous, but our heart has, I believe, 40,000 neurons, neural connections anyway. The belief is that our heart does communicate with the brain, and we'd be fools to think it doesn't. But in that same way, since our brain has these neurons that communicate with the heart neurons, all we can assume is that all of the organs in the body are tied into this neural system. I mean, how could it not be, right? If I were to tell you 50 years ago that the gut talks to the brain, and the gut tells the brain, you know, what it's eaten, and that the brain talks to the gut and tells it what it wants, people would probably laugh at it and say, oh no, the stomach is just at the mercy of the brain. You know, the brain just does what it does and the stomach just acts on accordance. But that was never explained well. Well, now we know there's a vagus nerve between the brain and the gut. And when you get a gut feeling, or a gut wrenching, or a, butterflies in your stomach, that's a real feeling that we all have and we all understand. But how could your brain cause a gut feeling? And vice versa. How do we understand now that food in our diet causes depression in many cases, and that a simple fecal transplant, as disgusting as it sounds, can actually change a person's life by giving them the life-saving bacteria they need? Who would have known 50 years ago that bacteria would be part of our consciousness? Think about that for a minute. It's the gut flora, the gut bacteria that help us digest food, that produce serotonin, that produce 90% of the dopamine, norepinephrine, acetylcholine. All of these processes are at least in part helped by having these bacteria, which we know outnumber our own cells now. And so the question I guess I'm proposing is, how do we know bacteria aren't our gods? How do we know we're not walking sacks that are designed for these bacteria to transport themselves to other planets? Bacteria get together and they're like, yeah, man, we got to get some vessels to transport ourselves around in. All right, let's create these creatures, and we can make them conscious. This is all metaphor. And then make them conscious enough to create machines that can get us off this damn planet before it's gone. And perhaps this has happened several times in history. But even the most open-minded scientists, like the guy who was on, the fact that this 87-year-old man was on Joe Rogan talking about consciousness, and he's a prominent, well-known scientist, the fact that even him, when he was asked by Joe, do you believe that there's other intelligent life elsewhere in the universe, he said he doesn't. That he really has his suspicions, and how we're dogmatic even when we're totally open-minded. That we all have our shortcomings, but having, I guess, an open enough mind to go on Joe Rogan, as that guy did, and talk about these things, on a show like that, where, you might have chemtrail fanatics one week and, Jordan Peterson fans the next week, and then you have this little old man talking about this deep, deep physics within the universe and how black holes might operate. You start to ask yourself some questions, and one of the questions that came up during the discussion constantly, they talked about all the different theories of multiverses, and he just says he doesn't care about all that, and I don't either. I think that that's great, because he basically just said the whole idea that there's different dimensions occurring at the same time, and that we have multiverses, and that they overlap. He's like, oh, that's just basically junk, and that's how I feel too. Even if it exists, it still doesn't help us explain anything at all. And it's theories like that that lead to the ideas like the Mandela effect, which people swear is true, but I've studied the lists of Mandela effects, and they all seem to be simply connected within things that our own minds would obviously make a mistake with, at least more often than not, so I won't go into detail on that. But he was asked about dark matter and why 90% of what's in the universe we don't even understand, and it's pretty absurd. And the idea that now they've found galaxies without dark matter, or maybe it's dark energy, so they don't even understand how their theories might work anymore, and how we're so caught up in the dogma of our theories. My point here is to empower people by saying that there are no real experts on consciousness. That's what I wanted to get to, and that's the main point. And that sounds arrogant when there are people that spend their whole lives studying it, but I've listened to the experts. I've read their dissertations, their papers, their theories. Nobody knows. Nobody understands how consciousness operates. Sure, we know neurons fire, but it's different to having neurons fire to get something done, or your cerebellum's working in the background and subconscious to, when you're driving and thinking and doing other things at the same time. But what about it when it comes to recalling specific events in detail, closing your eyes and conjuring these things? When you create a picture in your head, you're literally bringing that back to life. It's quite an amazing thing. I mean, everything goes deep if you get too far into it, and I don't want to go there. But another thing that was discussed is, can information be encoded? And he even went so far as to say that maybe perhaps before this universe, before the Big Bang, perhaps information could be somehow encoded into energy, into photons, things that we don't understand. Maybe this is what dark energy is. Perhaps this is how we explain things like scalar energy, which is not just a device that helps to heal you. Scalar energy is not understood. So if you hear that word, you ask for a specific definition of what scalar energy is. But all these keywords are used by people selling you shit, so it's constantly something to be aware of. One of the biggest questions I got out of all this, this, and not just this, this was just an hour discussion between them. I'm talking, this is stuff I've been thinking about for decades. And one of the biggest questions that comes up is direct knowledge possible? And that's a big one for me. In other words, is it possible for you to know something without being able to completely explain it at all and being completely right about it? And when it comes to trying to understand the earth, the connections, when you walk out into the woods and you ask to be shown the truth, to be shown and understand things, sometimes a few mushrooms don't hurt. You might get some delusions in there, but who's to say that some of these truths that continuously resurface aren't things that we just know inherently? We're laughed at if we're told that, oh, we believe that the universe is conscious or that the world is conscious. To me, a scientist telling me, somebody a physics professor, and if I were to come up and say, I believe the universe is conscious, and for him to laugh at that, all I could think is, he's wrong. I just know this because the universe exists. It must be conscious. If we are conscious, it must be conscious in its own way. In other words, everything greater than us must be on ascending levels of awareness. That sounds absurd to many people, I'm sure, but it makes absolute sense to me. It's like something that I continuously have been shown over and over again. When I walk through the woods, I believe the trees are aware of my presence there. A lot of people just believe they're trees, That is my religion in a way. It's my church, being out in that element, or with friends and family, or living life, being part of all of this. It's just crazy. And the fact that we are consciously aware of it and we are observing it makes it more difficult to assess what consciousness is because we're immersed in it. It's just like in quantum physics, the observer effect and how it corrupts studies. Science doesn't like to talk about the fact that we just don't know certain things, or at least certain aspects of it. But the fact that we have double-blind placebo trials shows just how strong the brain is, but also how strong the brain of the doctor who's administering the medicine is. Double-blind means not even the doctor knows what's administered, so his thoughts can't affect the experiment. Why? I mean, it's because we understand things are deeper, but we dare not try to assume we know how it operates. And I can understand that. We only want to be able to prove what we can prove. The rest of it is mystical and speculative. But there's enough of it to show that there's something else going on there. And with consciousness, it's, I think we can have direct knowledge and know certain things that we can't explain to one another. Everything, like they say, everything is based on some sort of a frequency or vibration. But once again, the New Age kind of crowd takes that to some extent to talk about raising your frequencies, raising your vibration. And it's like, to what level and to what end, It doesn't make sense to me. I understand everything is in vibration, but that doesn't mean that raising it or having a higher frequency really means anything. But maybe it does, and I don't know. Perhaps when you raise your intelligence so you can raise your consciousness, you are able to acquire new knowledge that you were previously not privy to, and that makes total sense. Think of it this way: if you didn't learn language, you wouldn't be able to think of these words in your head, so you wouldn't be able to create these ideas as easily. There's a whole line of study that talks about whether or not we could think without language. Can we think without language? Most people don't think much of it. If you can even speak, then you can think in words, and we always have that background chatter going on. It's like I was on my way to pick up my kids from school, and I had that background chatter going on, and I thought, oh, I've heard people, in the past I've tried to abolish that background noise, but now I'm embracing it because I realize it's important. That's how we grow. We're running over ideas in our heads and processing what ifs and what could be's and thinking of new theories. You can't just go through life with the silence in your mind. You need to think these things through. So, in the end, if something comes out that seems too good to be true and has a lot of backing behind it, a new discovery, if it doesn't have any previous science to back it, it will be ignored if it conflicts with the dogma of the current paradigm. So we're kind of stuck as individuals being the researchers. For anybody who moves to the woo-woo area, just what I found is because I got sucked into that for a long time. But then I learned that reality is strange enough. And I don't need to make up any ideas about, theories that I think might be true when I can see what's right in front of me. And so perhaps it has more to do with the more you learn and expand your horizons, the less you need to prove anything. The less you need to attach yourself to dogma. And you can be content to just believe that, well, whatever you choose, of course. But for me, the fact that consciousness is something that is so difficult to understand that you can spend 20 minutes on a video talking about it and not get anything accomplished. Except for to process more of the same ideas. But perhaps somebody else gained something from that. I was hoping by the end maybe I would understand the meaning of life, but I try. I'll talk to y'all later. Have a good one, and be conscious.